The Terraria Calamity mod is widely considered the best Terraria mod of all time, and it's the most played one as well. But more and more across the internet, I've noticed something. There are a lot of people who actually think that the Calamity mod is overrated. Now, there are a lot of reasons people might think this, and I want to talk about that and then give my 2 cents as somebody who is nearing the end of their first playthrough. So, let's get straight into it. Is Terraria's Calamity mod overrated? Let's get started with the criticisms, because there are a lot of fair things that people can say that are not in favor of the Calamity mod. First of all, the boss fight balancing really isn't perfect if you think about it. There are a lot of boss fights earlier in the game that are difficult, and then in the middle that are hard, and then ones afterwards which are easy, and then ones after that which are impossible, and it's just kind of all over the place. At the very least, that's how it is in Revengeance mode, which is the way, according to the developers, you're meant to play the mod. Having some level of inconsistency within boss difficulty is natural, but I feel like it's kind of all over the place with this mod. I have no idea if the boss I'm going into is going to be extremely difficult or if the boss I'm going into is just going to be a cakewalk. The Terraria Calamity mod as a whole is kind of inconsistent when it comes to progression and pacing. Certain parts of the game are extremely easy and feel like they might as well be vanilla Terraria, while other parts of the mod feel impossible and straight up insane. In my first playthrough at least, it was just all over the place. The early game was surprisingly difficult and I had to get the hang of what I was doing. Late pre-hard mode was surprisingly easy and it only took me a few tries to beat the Slime God and Wall of Flesh, but then after beating the Wall of Flesh, it felt like I had entered hell itself and went into the most difficult video game of all time. Early hard mode Calamity mod Terraria is genuinely miserable. It is so hard to actually make progress unless you're a god at the game, and I, very much so, am not a god at the game. What's weird though is that after getting through the very early stages of hard mode Terraria, I beat the twins with basically 1 or 2 attempts, I beat Calamitous in 1 attempt. It's kind of like you're just playing ping pong between super easy and super difficult, and there's no in between a lot of the time. Moving on from the difficulty itself though, I think the Calamity mod does have a slight issue with content bloating and just being overwhelming in general. There's so much stuff in this mod, and that certainly makes it feel unique and irreplaceable, but it is overwhelming. A lot of the stuff in the mod doesn't necessarily feel super useful or impactful off rip, so a lot of it just kind of feels like wasted space. A lot of these items do get used in advanced crafting trees later in the game, and you just don't realize how valuable they are at the beginning, but there's just so much stuff that you have no idea what's going on half the time, at least in your first playthrough. Terraria is already an extremely confusing game, especially for new players, so the last thing it needs is a mod that makes the game even more confusing. Another thing people have pointed out is that a lot of bosses in Calamity are not actually entirely original. A lot of them take attacks from other boss fights and simply reuse them and look slightly different while actually offering very similar gameplay. The Ravager, for example, actually plays out pretty much exactly like the Golem boss fight, except you're in a more open arena, and you just don't notice how similar these bosses are because, well, they look very different, or at least they look a little different. But when you actually break down the gameplay of a lot of bosses in Calamity, they're very similar to base game Terraria bosses, just with a few extra steps. People have also mentioned that there are a lot of worm boss fights in the Calamity mod, and that is true. There are like 28 or 29 bosses in Calamity, and then there are 8 worm bosses. Honestly, it's not a big deal to me, but I see why somebody wouldn't like that. It kind of takes away from the variety. You know, if you're coming into this mod expecting every boss to be new or unique, you're probably not going to enjoy the fact that 8 bosses are worm fights, which play very differently but still have somewhat of a similar idea. The final thing I've seen people say is that the Calamity mod has very confusing and unnecessary lore, and I think that's just obviously true. I mean, seriously, are most players, or at least the vast majority of them, gonna go out there and research these little lore things in the Calamity mod and try to piece everything together and find all the various little things? No, they're not. Terraria is a fantastic game, the mods are great. I do not come to Terraria mods for the lore. I come for the boss fights and the gameplay. It's cool that they have their own lore, and I don't hate them for it, but I do agree that it's very unnecessary, and if they got rid of it from the mod, I don't think it would make a huge difference for most people. Now, those are all of the big complaints I've seen people make about the Calamity mod. We could get into deeper balancing problems and all of that stuff, and I'm sure people have more knowledge on that than I do, but when it comes to the mod itself, I feel like that stuff isn't really necessary in the big picture. So now let's move on to the things that the Calamity mod does right, and why I believe it is still a great mod. First of all, most boss fights are still, in one way, shape, or form, very mechanically unique, and they're all pretty visually unique. They do recycle the attacks of other enemies a lot of the time, that's true, but I really wouldn't say that I've ever fought a boss fight in Calamity and I thought, man, that was way too similar to that other boss fight. The bosses are just fun too, man. I can't talk about death mode, I can't talk about classic mode, but looking at Revengeance, it's fun, and that's all that really matters. Obviously fun is subjective and all that, but clearly it was good enough to be fun for most people, and there's a reason that the Calamity mod is so popular. These bosses are simply insane, and I truly haven't had more fun fighting bosses in Terraria, let alone really a video game as a whole, like I have in the Calamity mod. Even if every single final boss fight in the game was a total disaster, I would still argue that Terraria Calamity has some of the best boss design of any mod in any video game. The amount of new content in general is incredible, and there is a huge expansion on the base game. This is super corny to say, but it is kind of true. Terraria Calamity feels like more than a mod. It feels like a huge reimagining of an amazing game, and I feel like the developers could very well make their own game and be very successful with it. I often do wonder, why did the Calamity mod developers decide to add so much amazing content to the game instead of just creating their own game, which they could probably profit off of way more? The soundtrack is just the Calamity mod soundtrack. I mean, that one is self-explanatory. I think even the Calamity mod's biggest hate club would probably admit that it has a fantastic soundtrack. I wouldn't just say it has one of the best mod soundtracks in any video game, I would say it's one of the best OSTs in video game history in general. Now that might be an outrageous statement, but I can't think of 5 games off the top of my head where I prefer the soundtrack to Terraria Calamity. Whether it be that ambient music that plays in areas like the Abyss or the Underworld, or insane boss themes like Roar of the Jungle Dragon, Terraria Calamity really has it all when it comes to great music. I also do really like the quality of life additions that the Calamity mod has. Some vanilla Terraria purists are gonna hate this, but I do like the increased movement speed, I like the increased pickaxe speed, because I feel like those things should probably be in Terraria already. Not every early game pickaxe needs to be as fast as the drill containment unit, but I feel like Terraria pickaxes, especially in the early game, do still feel kinda slow and repetitive. Mining should be something you have to do to reach a destination, but it shouldn't feel like a chore, and in modern Terraria I would say it does, whereas in Calamity it feels like it's more of a small little thing you do in between tasks. Although to be fair, I think one could very well argue this is a bad thing for the balancing, so I'm not even saying that's the biggest reason the Calamity mod is really that good. The last reason I think this mod is fantastic is, simply put, it has some of the best replay value of any mod that I've seen. It has so many different classes, so many new weapons, so many different difficulty options, and with all of that comes incredible replayability. I bet I could play this mod over 100 times more, and I would still find a new way to fight bosses, some new gear, a new idea, or something that makes it fresh, and I love that. Replayability is something that is increasingly common in games, so it's not like this is a Calamity mod specific thing, but I'm gonna be real, I love the Thorium mod for example, but I would never see myself replaying that nearly as much as I see myself replaying Terraria Calamity. And even I would admit that Thorium absolutely overall does have better balancing than Calamity. It's not even close. Overall, I think the Calamity mod is fantastic, and while it may have its small problems which people are free to express, I don't think it's really that bad by any means. So when it comes to the Calamity mod being overrated, I would say no, I don't think it is. But as always, I would love to hear what you think, so let me know in the comments if you think the Calamity mod is actually overrated, or you enjoy the mod just as much as I do. Alright, bye-bye.